time, ticketing time, ticketing time, 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 ticketing time, ticketing time, ticketing time, time.
Once, when I was 6 years old, I read a book about a primeval forest. The book said boa constrictors swallow their prey whole without chewing it. I pondered this deeply, and then I made my first drawing. I showed my masterpiece to grown-ups and asked if the drawing frightened them.
Frightened? Why should anyone be frightened of a hat?
Grown-ups, they never understand anything by themselves. So, I made another drawing.
Yes. My advice is stick to arithmetic.
History and grammar.
I took their advice, and I grew up.
So this past January when the Oscar nominees came out, why yes, this video has been in production a long time, I noticed something funny about the animated feature category. I mean, obviously Inside Out was going to win, but there was a movie missing from the list that I was curious about. I remembered a trailer I had seen over a year before, and then I never heard from it again. And it turns out that the movie had already come out in France, but it hadn't come out in American theaters yet. But then they pulled the movie from theaters a year later, but it was still before it came out in America, and the end? Is it out? Is the movie out? It'll be out soon. Or you can just buy it on Blu-ray right now. Right? Blu-ray right now? Is that true? For the uninitiated, Le Petit Prince, or The Little Prince, was a short novel written by French writer, aviator, and these things, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in 1943. This book was written in the middle of World War II between two of his other works, the first being a memoir detailing part of his time in the French Air Force, and the other a manuscript dedicated to the French living under Nazi oppression. So, yeah, The Little Prince is a pretty different sort of work from him. In short, the story is that a pilot who crashes his plane in the Sahara Desert meets a precocious young boy. A boy he calls the Little Prince for reasons. As the pilot spends time fixing his plane, the prince tells his story, which is fantastical and more resembles a tall tale. The prince lives on a small asteroid surrounded by other small asteroids, each containing their own characters. And on the prince's journey, he eventually meets these characters, each with their own philosophies. The book is in large part a fable, a contemporary allegory that addresses a variety of themes. And while it can be daunting to unpack a book whose symbols and philosophical themes have been talked about at length, it's worth it to re-examine one of the book's themes in relation to the movie. Usually, as a rule, I try not to compare film adaptations to the source material, whether they're books or games or anything else, because a degree of artistic license has to be granted in converting an experience written on the page for the screen. And more often than not, dramatic changes have to be made to keep it engaging. But in this case, I'm making an exception to that rule for two reasons. The first is that the film isn't actually a direct adaptation of the original story. But the second reason is because I think a prominent theme is lost in translation, or at the very least it sends mixed messages. In the movie, a girl moves into a new home with the intent of getting admitted to a prestigious school, and because of this, she and her overbearing mother move in next to an old pilot who's eccentric and arguably dangerous to others in the community. Seriously, he almost kills people like several times in this movie. Through the first half hour of the film, it's clear that the relationship between the mother and the daughter is one-sided. While the mother's intentions are good, she doesn't really see that her daughter hasn't had much opportunity to make her own decisions. Also, the girl has no childlike wonder because she's actively being conditioned to be soulless grown-up 47 here. But when the girl meets the pilot, he tells her the story of the Little Prince, and it becomes clear to us that he's not a dangerous menace, he's just someone who never let go of their inner child. But as she hears more of the pilot's story, the girl starts to see the futility in the life her mother has planned for her. She begins to live life as she should, as a child, uncaring of all the adult responsibilities forced upon her at a young age. And I feel I should add that this first half hour is excellent, I wouldn't change a thing. But it's the third act of the movie where the message takes a left turn. Well, I say a left turn, but it's more like it falls off the rails and explodes in a big fiery ball. This part of the movie is all original content, so it lacks the appeal of the original story to fall back on. It's like some Hollywood executive stood up in the middle of the screening and was like, "There's no adventure!" I don't know why he sounds like this. "There has to be a big adventure! Also put Ant-Man in it!" I guess I just imagine that that's how all Hollywood executives sound. Any Hollywood executives out there, please feel free to correct me. In the third act, it's like you're watching a completely different movie. The pilot is rushed to the hospital because he's an old person in a movie. Clearly, he's not long for this world. And this puts our protagonist into a panic. She immediately takes off in the pilot's plane to search for the little prince, assuming he'll know what to do. The story's worlds, which up until this point have been clearly separate, begin to blur. Not only has the stop-motion look of the fable vanished, but our protagonist now has a stuffed fox sidekick, and the dilapidated plane all of a sudden takes off with no trouble. Her literal interpretation of the fable of the little prince starts to backseat drive the movie. They find a world inhabited by all the grown-ups the prince has encountered in the pilot's tale, but they all seem to have forgotten their origins, and more importantly, they've forgotten their time with the prince. And this almost works, as the characters from the fable are placed into roles that make sense. Most notably, the king who works as an elevator attendant, the small metal box being his own isolated kingdom. It makes it seem as if the characters in the fable are exaggerated versions of their real-life counterparts, but it gets weird when she meets Mr. Prince, played by Ant-Man. But wait, why is Paul Rudd playing a little boy? Because the prince has been forced to grow up by the businessman.
You did this? But you're supposed to just count the stars.
Own. Say it with me. Own. I own the stars.
But here's the thing, the businessman in the book was no more important than any of the other characters. He was a grumpy stick-in-the-mud who would sit at his desk and claim to own the stars. The operative word here being claim. He had no interest in entertaining the prince because he was too wrapped up in matters of consequence. His philosophy wasn't any more valid than the previously mentioned king in denial over his lack of power.
You shall have your sunset. I shall command it. But I shall wait till conditions are favorable.
When will that be?
That will be, this evening, about 20 minutes to 8.
Or the conceited man who seeks admiration without merit.
Am I not the handsomest, the best dressed, the richest? I'm the most intelligent man on this planet.
Or the alcoholic who, while missing from the film, lives in a perpetual downward spiral. In the movie, though, the businessman's been promoted from side character to full-on villain. His philosophy rules over everything. His business of counting and owning stars, brushed off as a misguided and shallow attempt at self-importance in the book, has now monopolized what appears to be the entire universe. He's literally captured the stars and bottled them up somewhere like a crazy Jiminy Cricket? I don't know. This is in direct contrast to the less tangible way of claiming ownership by writing them on a slip of paper and throwing them in a drawer without further question. The book's prince was able to deconstruct the businessman's matters of consequence instantly, seeing the stars as cosmic bodies that couldn't be owned, showing no appreciation for the businessman's businessness. And at the beginning of the movie, this prince does the exact same thing.
I count them, then I recount them.
But what good does that do you?
Well, it does me the good of making me rich. How's that?
And what good does it do you to be rich?
It makes it possible for me to buy more stars.
But in the third act, this prince for some reason has been beaten down and completely fallen to the businessman. Awkward story pacing issues aside, the problem here isn't the sudden blurred lines of the two worlds. The problem is when the movie's message is mixed by the villain. In the second act of the film, the pilot drops this dose of wisdom to the girl and the viewer by proxy.
I'm not so sure I want to grow up anymore.
Growing up is not the problem. Forgetting is. I managed to grow up, and I never forgot the little prince.
But the third act treats both things as one and the same. By forcing the prince to grow up, he's forgotten his childhood memories. And the businessman threatens to force the girl to grow up. And based on what happened to the prince, we can assume that growing up will also make the girl forget what it's like to be a child. Suddenly, and maybe unintentionally, growing up has become the big bad.
Return to your desk, please.
This movie didn't need a villain with a face, just as the book didn't have one. The most terrifying demons are the ones we can't quantify. The idea that we can lose something as important to us as our childlike wonder solely because we let ourselves forget is terrifying. But at the same time, in the original story, there is a way back. You can be reminded of what you forgot long ago. The pilot makes a conscious effort in his life to remind himself of the absurdity of adulthood. One of the clearest indications of this is presented in his own drawings. Not in any specific detail, but through their sheer existence. He gave up drawing as a child, and yet he tells his story in his own illustrations. And the beginning as well as the very end of the movie understand this, as the drawings have a heavy presence. The pilot almost forgot, but he was given a reminder. And he didn't need to abandon the notion of growing up to internalize that. The question now, of course, is why does this matter? Is there any value to this lesson about not forgetting your inner child? Is there a reason to be wary of falling into the pitfalls of adulthood? Why did I write this in the first place? I wouldn't be making this video if I didn't think the answer to these questions was yes. Except this one. But I do have a short story to show why I did write this. About 15 years after I first read this book as a kid, / 2 years ago, a friend showed me this image. It's the second image from the book, which, as we now know from earlier, depicts a snake digesting an elephant. But when I was shown this picture, I looked at it for a time confused. I eventually said, quote, "That hat looks awfully familiar." I had become an adult whether I liked it or not. But more importantly, I had completely forgotten the meaning of this drawing. There's a quote attributed to C.S. Lewis that I think is really important, and it's kind of long, but the most important part is what he says at the very end. When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret and would have been ashamed if I had been found doing so. Now that I'm 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown-up. It's a condemnation of acting adult simply because that's what's expected of you, and it celebrates the importance of always holding on to that childlike wonder. That balance has always been important to me. I mean, I'm making a persuasive video on the internet about a cartoon right now. Upon rediscovering this story, I've come to the conclusion that The Little Prince is a book that's meant to be experienced twice. Once as a child, and then again as an adult. Maybe even every few years. And it's only by taking our experiences and re-examining them through the eyes of this precocious blonde-haired boy that we realize that grown-ups are certainly very, very odd.